joining us on Checkpoint tonight. The hashtag is Checkpoint on Twitter, at KTN Kenya, at Yvonne Okwara, at John Allen Namu is how you can reach us. SMS line is 22155. Would love to hear your views. Today we're talking about the proposal to expand the mandate of the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. A lot has been said about it, how much money is going into it. We hope to have a holistic discussion about it tonight. My guests on my extreme, that would be right, yes, Apollo Mboya, who's the CEO of the Law Society of Kenya. Thanks for joining us. Esther Oweru from the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and Ngunjiri Wambugu likes to call himself a political commentator, but on this one was in Addis, and so we'll start right with you.
Yeah.
So you were there, and you were talking about this expanded court. Would you just want to, in a few minutes, make the case for this court for us tonight?
Actually, the easiest way to make the case for this court is ICC has been an interesting experience for Kenya. And if we were to ever come up with a court, I don't think we could do any worse than ICC has been, in my opinion. Part of the problem about the ICC has been the lack of context, being able to actually contextualize the reason that the things that happened in 2007 happened, and also being unable to understand the political settlements that were made. This is actually which tends to happen a lot in African settings. So the reason, the need for an African court is, one, you want a court that is going to be able to contextualize what happens in Africa, that's going to be run on African structures. I know there are people who are arguing that Africans do bad things, but we are all Africans. We have local courts that work. So I don't know why somebody would argue that a regional court would not work. So that is part of my problem. And then in essence, we're not saying the ICC is a bad court, but it's complementarity. You want to start from a local court to a regional court to an international court. So there's a gap that needs to be filled. Okay, you say the ICC is not bad, but actually it is bad. Okay. Didn't say it's not bad. You just said, well, it's not so bad. But let's talk about this. The linking of ICC to terror in the country. Yes. You say the OTP continues, that's the Office of the Prosecutor, continues to legitimize criminal gangs such as Mungiki and embolden them and their offshoots to continue committing crimes. Explain that to us. You see, what has been happening is, from the records we've been, from what we've been learning and from what we've been hearing, part of the witness structure that OTP has been depending on has been Mungiki. Now, the problem about depending on a group that is proscribed is that in a situation like when you're dealing with Kenya and you've made the state an enemy, anytime the state does anything against that proscribed group, you can argue that they're actually intimidating them. Has that happened? Has that argument been made, though? Where? What do you mean? Like has you say, has that argument been made? That you can argue that if Kenya is fighting these proscribed groups, that then it means that... This is the problem we have. We have a situation... Remember, we have a situation where the state doesn't know who the witnesses the ICC have are. So today if you arrest a Mungiki suspect and then he ends up being an ICC witness, that's an if, though. No, it's an if, but that's exactly what you're talking about. So you're in a situation where you've created a lacuna of sorts where a certain group cannot be touched, lest you be told by Bensouda that you're actually interfering with it. And in so doing, the ICC is yes, because again we have seen in the country Al-Qaeda outsources terror to local groups, local criminal groups. It does that across the world. We've seen them in Boko Haram, we have seen them with ISIS. What stops them from outsourcing terror here? All right, just hold that thought. Esther, do you hear a conversation about the victims in all of this, AU versus ICC, the government, the state being made an enemy at the ICC? Do you hear anything about the victims in this conversation? Yvonne, unfortunately, again, that's a discussion that is lost. We haven't had, I mean, even from Ngunjiri's opening remarks, he has not even mentioned victims who are at the core of whatever system it is that you're seeking to establish. It's all about the terror groups. It's about, accused persons and the failings of the ICC. I think, just to latch on to what Ngunjiri is saying, it is, I think for me it's an argument that is lost, that we're actually saying that the ICC is perpetrating terrorism in Kenya, and then to say that Mungiki is untouchable, for me is an argument that is being made about the failure of the state to actually deal with its own processes. I mean, if Kenya cannot deal with Mungiki and then cries foul because there could be or may be witnesses to be used by FATU, I think for me is really an indictment on the state upon its ability to deal with insecurity.
All right. Let's, before we come to you, Apollo, I'd like to just stick on the issue of victims for just a moment. We have a clip from a gentleman, and we'd mentioned this at the beginning of this bulletin, Donald Dare. He is the CEO of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Now, he was making these remarks at a seminar last year on international justice, reconciliation and peace in Africa, ICC and beyond, and he was speaking about the victims, just about this whole crisis. Where do they fall in this? Just listen to what he had to say, and then we can carry on with our conversation.
I think victims have been instrumentalized across the board by all actors. The states have ignored them. The continental human rights system may not have paid enough attention. The ICC itself has ignored them. And it is very important to have more scientific studies, more empirical studies, more direct conversations with victims to find out what their needs in particular circumstances may be.
All right, Esther, let's come to you. Do you agree with what Donald had to say in that clip?
I agree with Don, primarily on the issue that, for crimes to occur, there have to be victims. It is these victims who are the ones who really need to see justice being done for them, who really need to have guarantees of non-repetition of whatever violations it is that they have suffered. Unfortunately, and I agree with Don, that at the various levels, at the national level, we've totally forgotten about the victims. You only get to hear about, a small group of IDPs, those who are in camps who've been resettled. We have had hardly any discussion around integrated IDPs who continue to, languish in various settlements around the country. We haven't heard about the refugees, the over 1,500 refugees who are in Uganda. There have been no efforts to bring them back to the country. But over and above this, I think it's also the question of, at the regional and at the international level, it's to what extent can we actually, incorporate victims in all the processes. When you look, for instance, at the International Criminal Court, we have two types of victims. You have situation victims, those who are, largely victims from the situation in the Kenyan context, the victims of the post-election violence broadly. And then at the second level, you have victims of the case. So these are victims who have been allowed to participate within a particular case and draw their reparations from that particular instance. That discussion, again, when you bring it back to the local context, even within our own judicial processes, there isn't much attention that is given to the space of victims to actively participate in those proceedings. Even in the case of criminal proceedings, victims are left to the role of being a witness as opposed to actually being seen as a victim, and therefore being made, having justice systems that are responsive to their needs.
Okay. Yeah, very quick point.
Something on the victims.
Yes.
We are the first group, Kenya Citizens Coalition, that has actually done an audit on victims. And 7 years since post-election violence happened, we actually went out, did an audit of what happened to all the victims of post-election violence. Nobody else has ever done it. We found how much money has been spent by the government on victims, how many cases have led to convictions, how many cases went to court, where are the victims right now, and that document where you actually quote that comes from that document that you said 7 years later. So this saying that we have not been talking about victims, we actually made victims our primary discussion. That is where we grew when we went to Addis and we went to the ASP in New York. That's where we were coming from. We're saying, look, it's 7 years. This is what has happened. We've got some NGOs telling the world that nothing has happened. And we actually needed to prove that many things
are you one of those NGOs
not enough,
saying nothing
but
has happened?
many things have happened.
I think I want to react to what Ngunjiri has said, and first just to correct the impression that some NGOs are saying that nothing has happened. I do not think, I haven't come across any NGO from Kenya that has said that nothing has happened. We have acknowledged that something has been done by government, but it's not conclusive, and therefore there is room to do much more. I just want to react to the report that Ngunjiri mentions, and the fact that he says that over 7 years after the violence, there hasn't been any documentation on victims. And just to correct Ngunjiri, the Kenya Human Rights Commission and ICJ Kenya carried out an extensive mapping of all victims across Kenya. That is an exercise that took over 3 months.
When?
As compared.
When? No,
that was in 2011. That was in 2011.
Yes.
So it's still within the 7-year span that you're talking about. But our mapping exercise was extensive. It was done over a period of more than 4 months. The writing of the report took another 2 months. as compared to Ngunjiri, where he went out for 2 days and came out with a report. That cannot in any way be extensive.
2 months.
Right.
It's unfortunate that
your report says 17th and 18th of November.
No.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd like
read the report.
Ladies, gentlemen, I'd like to bring in Apollo Boya for just a minute before we can carry on with this discussion. Apollo, from the legal standpoint, what does it say about Kenya, though, when we're yet to set up the international criminal division in the country, and that is something that has been we've been working on. Sometimes it's lack of funds. What does that say about now our push to say, oh, we can do this? ICC is not doing a good job, but bring it back to Africa. Yet Kenya is lagging behind in this regard.
Thank you very much. First of all, the issue of the African court is, in principle, a noble idea. Its timing, suspect. It's the intention, suspect. Why am I saying this? Since the year 2012 in May, if I can recall, a task force was formed for the purposes of examining on how to create International Crimes Division as a division of the High Court of Kenya. The report came out and gave certain proposals. Of course, nothing has become of that report up to now. Up to now, we don't have the Crimes Division, which can be created administratively, because that's what the report said, and the Chief Justice can do that. That court needs resources, the same resources we are talking about, that we want to donate to the African court.
Right.
And just to pick up on what Mujiri said, that we should start from the local, go to regional, then go to international. We have not done local.
What do you mean we haven't done local?
The
we have got
International
courts. I mean, I don't understand when we say we haven't done local. We have courts in this country that actually work. Are they perfect? No. But they work, because otherwise, if we are not working, we will not be having people going to court. The second point I'd like to make is, we have a situation where, for example, people are saying that the reasons why the African Union is being suggested are suspect. The International Criminal Court was instituted because of things that had happened, including Rwanda. So a lot of these decisions always are a reaction to something. When you say it's suspect because of the Kenyan case, Uhuru has already been let go. It doesn't affect Ruto's case. So at what point would you say it's suspect? What Kenya is saying, in my opinion, is that there are certain lessons that Kenya has learned. And actually, in fact, what I heard them telling the other African states at Addis was, from our own experience, our experience with this court has been terrible. And we are saying, so that nobody else goes through an experience like we did,
nobody
you need an African court.
including heads of state, because they're being offered immunity at
But
this court.
come on, Yvonne, let's be honest. International Criminal Court gives heads of state of first world countries immunity. So why are we having a problem?
Is that correct? Is that the position?
No, let's be very honest. China, Russia, Britain, America sit on the permanent. Yes, they have veto powers of a case.
That's
you want to tell
right,
me they're going to pass a case
but America
about
is not
their
a
own boss?
signatory to the ICC.
Yes, but they have veto powers over the over the International Criminal Court. They can actually stop a case from going on.
So because that's happening there, it should happen here as well.
Let's also agree, our own laws actually give presidents immunity. So what we're saying is that our own laws are not good enough. They do. Our own laws, the Kenyan law.
We have legal minds here.
So let me explain what I mean. I know Esther is going to argue that we have signed a statute that says for that particular case he has no. I'm talking about remove that particular statute. Let's talk about legal issues that are happening.
But let's talk about that statute, Ngunjiri, though, because that is what we ratified.
Yes.
I think, Ngunjiri, Article 143 of the Kenyan Constitution is express. There is no immunity for a sitting head of state for international crimes. That, by its very face value, it means there is no immunity for whatever it is.
Come on, we can't take Uhuru to court for stuff that happened.
However, though, we did, and they found that there was no case and they didn't have enough evidence. Doesn't that, in one way or
not? It didn't happen to him when he was president. It started before he became president.
Absolutely.
Second thing is, when Kibaki, whether it's Kibaki or Moi or Jomo Kenyatta, when they were sitting heads of state, you could not take them to court until they left. That's our law.
But for international crimes,
yes. For international crimes.
And the crimes we're talking about here are international crimes, are they not?
We're talking about a justice system that works for us. And we are saying that
That
the
works
justice
for
system that
who?
works for Kenya. Within the Kenyan judicial territory, you cannot take a sitting head of state to court, but you can take him outside.
But we
have, you get what I'm saying? We have cases.
Apollo?
We have a situation where our own laws cannot take a sitting head of state to court, but we can take him to another country.
Let me
Yeah,
chip in on that. I think what Ngunjiri has not brought out is that the International Criminal Court does not. How does it get seized of situation? Let's start from there.
Yes.
He has mentioned the issue of the Security Council. That's only one track.
Yes.
Now, a state can also refer itself.
Yes.
Okay? And we have, in fact, most of the African states have referred themselves.
Yes.
Okay? And the court also, suo motu, can also investigate.
Don't explain that so that Kenyans can understand.
Yes.
It means that the prosecutor can actually go and they've only done that once in the Kenyan case.
Yes. So
they haven't done it for Syria,
okay,
and they have the right to do it. But they haven't
just a
done
moment.
it.
Yeah.
1 million people have died.
Yeah. So whenever Ngunjiri talks about veto power, he has to be a little bit elaborate on that, because that's one track that he's talking about. So, and secondly, if we look at the Kenyan situation, we have an environment of non-accountability. That's the environment that is operating in Kenya. So whenever we are talking about this subject, we have to look at what is the environment under which we are having discourse. And non-accountability, that is the environment obtaining.
Okay. Very quickly, Apollo, do you believe that the AU leaders and the AU as a whole has the political will to make sure that this court delivers justice?
First of all, apart from lacking political will, they do not have the money. Okay? That kind of court requires adequate resources from the office of the prosecutor, from the issue of witness protection.
Right.
If the AU does not even have money to construct its own headquarters,
right.
it was constructed by China.
Let's bring that board up, because we're talking about who funds the AU, and, and let's just talk about some of those proposals. If you take a look, Ngunjiri, at the 2015 budget, and I hope we can bring that board up, for the AU, it's $1.281 billion. 72% of that will be funded by donors. And donors include the Western imperialists that are so much referred to when we're talking about
Same guys who fund the ICC. That's
same guys who fund the ICC. So how different will it be when 72% of this money is coming in?
Absolutely.
How do we say that they will not have control over this court when the operations of the entire African Union are wholly funded?
So why don't we actually allow them? If we are willing to allow them to fund the International Criminal Court as much as they're doing, why do we have a problem with them funding the African Union Court?
Well, it's all about control, like you mentioned.
Yes, but here, at least, we're going to have an African court. It's actually going to be called an African. You see, if I was this guy... Is
it about a name,
No, it's not about the name. It's about the context. We have a situation where Robin Cook, a former foreign secretary of the UK, said the International Criminal Court was not the kind of court that was set to hold accountable presidents and prime ministers of America and Britain. He said that on record. Yeah? Now, we're asking, so if this International Criminal Court was not set up to hold those kind of people accountable, who was it set up to hold accountable?
Let's talk about the funding issue for a moment.
Yes.
He who pays the piper calls the tune.
Yes.
If 72% of that, and what you're taking a look at on your screens now is proposals to fund the AU, SMSs that are sent in the region, air tickets, hotel stay, which a lot of member states have rejected, including Kenya, because it would hurt our economy. So let's talk about he who pays the piper calls the tune.
If I was,
you do not believe that the Western powers would have any say over this?
Let me tell you what I would do. If I'm the one who was suggesting how we should fund this, I would actually tax oil. I would tax the things the Western countries get from Africa to fund that court.
Okay.
Because they actually get resources from us. You see, that's actually how I would build that case up.
Right.
Because they're going to buy our oil, they're going to buy our diamonds. I would tax that and fund the court.
Did you give those suggestions?
I did. I hope they're going to be added.
Okay. But, when we're talking about the AU in particular, I'd like us to listen to another clip from Don Dare, who was talking about the work of the AU and perhaps in support of what the AU has done in Africa, perhaps making a case or not. I don't think that was his intention. But let's listen to what he had to say about the work of the AU, particularly in the Kenyan case.
For instance, people forget that in the case of Kenya, in early 2008, Kenya was going to totally implode. And it is the African Union that saved Kenya. The then chairperson of the African Union Assembly, President John Kufuor of Ghana, flew to Kenya and engaged in shuttle diplomacy between the two sides, the side of President Kibaki and the side of Raila Odinga, who then was the opposition leader. And when he realized that he could not conclude the deal in a short time, and he had a country to run, he used his powers under the Constitutive Act of the African Union and under the Peace and Security Council Protocol of the African Union to appoint a panel of eminent Africans to go and pitch shop in Kenya and work until they resolve the problem. So Kofi Annan was appointed by the African Union. He was presenting periodic reports to the African Union. He used the African laws to secure a deal. Another small thing that's forgotten about the Kenya scenario, in terms of cessation of hostilities, disarmament, demobilization and reintegration, and in terms of a political settlement, those are agendas 1, 2 and 3. AU law was used. But much more importantly, in terms of agenda 4, the long-term transitional justice reforms that led to a new constitution, that led to security sector reforms, that led to an accountability mechanism, the famous Waki Commission, that inquired into the electoral system and made recommendations around electoral reform, Kriegler. A lot of this came from previous work that another of the panelists, Her Excellency Gracia Machel, had done as the chairperson or leading the team under the African peer review mechanism that had reviewed the governance of Kenya just 2 years before. So APRM had made recommendations, and they had told Kibaki that if these things are not implemented by the next election, there will be war. So when there was war, Gracia Machel came back as one of the panelists and worked with both sides, with civil society, with the private sector and with Kenyans, to make sure that the Agenda 4 reforms that were proposed under APRM were implemented. So that shows us that the African system and mechanisms can work from time to time.
Okay, Apollo, I'd like your reaction to that.
Yes, I think what Donna said is factual. And to some extent, the realities that we are seeing today is part of the work that was done under the African Union. But I want to hasten to add that if you look at other parts of the agenda, for example, truth, justice and reconciliation, and we have the report, we're still holding it in our hands, and we've not seen any political will to implement what has been what is contained in that
Apollo,
report.
though, he does make a good case for the African Union, doesn't he, about the successes, and reminding us of who pulled us from the brink in 2007-2008.
That is true. It makes a good case for it, but he also shows the limitations of the African Union. So that is the discourse. But what he said is factual. But then, after that, why has Graca Machel not come back and say, okay, there is this truth and justice reconciliation was one of the agenda. Have you guys implemented it?
Is follow through?
No follow through.
Esther?
I think I agree with what Apollo is saying, and for me that is the real question that we should be debating here. It's what has happened to Kenya's transitional justice agenda, and in a lot of ways we've actually abandoned that and running off to the regional platform to really address a question which is primarily Kenya's responsibility. And so we appear in oftentimes, in my opinion, to be really allergic to responsibility. So whenever responsibility is flashed out, we want to run to the regional court, we want to blame the ICC, but really forgetting that the primary responsibility of dealing with cases of human rights violations, of prosecuting and investigating crimes against humanity, international crimes, even national crimes within our national laws, is really the responsibility of the government of Kenya. Is it then to say that we are not able within our own, not only judicial processes, but other transitional justice processes? For instance, Apollo mentions the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission report. Why have we abandoned that? And within the TJRC report, there are certain recommendations which for me are really non-contentious, which we haven't seen. For instance, within 6 months of the publishing of the report, the president was required to issue an apology for all human rights violations. Now that is not something that speaks to the question of criminal culpability, but we haven't seen it. What then, if I may, then of the African court, which will be dealing with the question of criminal culpability? Are we going to actually live up to its ideals?
Gunjiri?
First, I really like what Donna said. he's made a very
I bet you
interesting
would.
point. Oh yes, yes. He's made a very interesting point. He's actually explained, first and foremost, that a lot has actually been done.
By
He's
the
gone
AU.
through Agenda 1, Agenda 2, Agenda 3,
Right.
and part of Agenda 4. I have a big I'm an optimist, African optimist. I have a big problem with people who believe that we must get foreign interventions for us to get stuff done. The fact that we're not doing something doesn't mean we can't get it done.
You do have foreign interventions at the AU. You realize that, don't
Yes,
you?
but you see, we also have a
Funding the AU
funding-
is
Look,
a foreign
we are
intervention.
50 years old. We're dealing with we are being held to the same level as countries that have been around for 200 years. 300 years. South Africa is 30 years old. Zimbabwe, where our African Union chairman now comes from, is 30 years old. But you see, we have been held. We have been held to the same standard with countries that have taken 3 years to actually evolve.
Okay, but then just address the issues that they're talking about in
Yes.
terms of transitional justice and things like implementing the TJRC report, because
Actually,
that
that's where I was
perhaps,
coming.
yeah, would
That's
have
what's
nothing
coming.
to do with America
No.
being
I'm trying to put
independent for
context.
200-300
I'm trying to
years.
put context. America has been independent for 239 years. 60 years ago is when black people and women started voting. So and that I'm not saying, I'm just giving context that different countries take a different amount of time to deal with different things.
Great. So how much time do you think it'll take for us to do that, seeing as you're comparing?
What I would actually love Apollo and my sister here to do is to get in and help give solutions that we can work with from here,
How much
rather than
time?
suggest. I mean, I don't know. I hope it's going to happen in my lifetime.
Well, that sounds rather hopeful.
No, it's not, because you see, what happens is that countries tend to outlast us, and sometimes a situation that looks like it's really massive in our lifetime gets solved in our lifetime, but the state must continue. The most important thing we need to remember is that the state must go on.
You're not giving me a time frame. Let's have your closing comments as we go, Apollo.
Yes, my closing comments is this. Ngujiri is saying that because other countries have taken long to implement certain things, that we have to wait maybe another century or so. I don't agree with that. If we bring the victims into the debate, then they need justice
They are
right
in
now.
the debate.
The last thing I would like to say is this. Whenever these kind of discussions are going on, the messaging that is coming from the government also needs to be pinpoint, right from the people who are messaging every issue. Yeah, I'm not talking about Ngunjiri, but we have people who are running in town here, like somebody called Matsanga, who seems to be speaking for the government. And we wonder, how does a foreigner speak for the government? So messaging is also very key, and how it's delivered and how it's packaged, and the people who deliver it. We would like to see the Attorney General, the at high echelons of government, messaging these issues.
Okay. Esther?
I think for me, three things. First, at the national level, we need to be coherent about what we say about our own transitional justice processes. We need to carry out an intensive and thorough mapping of victims and address their issues at the national level. We also need to implement our Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission report. Let's recall the Waki Commission report, because oftentimes we've treated it as though it were a foreign document. It is a state document. Secondly, at the regional level, I think Kenya needs to be serious with its commitments at the regional level. And for me, the first thing, if we're really keen on getting regional mechanisms to work for us, is to get Kenya to actually make a declaration to Article 34.6 of the African, to the Protocol on the African Charter, which would allow individuals to submit, complaints against the government.
Okay.
At the international level, and I draw this from the statement made by Ambassador Macharia Kamau at the last Assembly of State Parties in New York last December, where he said that Kenya has been and remains to be a strong champion of the ICC. I think we need to move from rhetoric to action and really get Kenya to cooperate with the ICC meaningfully.
Okay. All right. Your final comments, if you can, in just 1 minute, and tell us about the amount of support that you're getting. Kenya has signed to it. We have
Which support?
For the AU court.
Oh,
we keep hearing
11
yeah.
countries have signed.
Have they signed?
Well, I won't
They have
believe
pledged.
Amina knows what she's talking about.
They
She
have
says they
pledged.
have signed. I don't know about
They have
whether
asked to
they've
go
pledged.
back to their people and ask through Parliament.
It took 10 years to get ICC where it is.
Yeah, so you keep saying.
Yeah. Malobo Protocol started last year, so I'm willing to give them time.
Okay.
But it's very important for us to understand that Africa is for Africans. Africa solutions are what's going to work for
African
problems.
funding.
Africa, you see what happens is you can help me. If I fight, my wife and I fight with you in the house, my friends can help me. But the solution to our problem
Would they
is going to be us.
Would they fund what's
can
going to happen in the house?
If we are fighting because we have no food, they can say, okay, hii pesa ya chakula ndio hii, so you guys are so fighting. But the solution is going to be us.
Okay.
So that's how we're going to solve our problems. And I think we also need to stop having an inferiority complex. We're as good as anybody else. If a law is good enough for Europe, for Britain, for America, it's good enough for us.
Esther's looking at him with a look of bewilderment on her face. Thank you for joining us. We have to leave it at that for now, but I thank you so much, Apollo Mboya, Esther Waweru, and Ngunjiri Wambugu, discussing matters AU. We'll be getting to your feedback in just a moment, but with all of that talk, what is the point tonight?
Right, what is the point indeed on in this discussion with respect to an African court? One discussion that has been going for quite some time, not just around the current ICC issues. And one interesting point to look at is the conversation around victims. That there's so much weight right now around the debate on immunity of heads of state and how heads of state would approach this court. Sort of puts in perspective and sort of puts in context the amount of weight that's not being put on a conversation around the people who actually suffer from African conflicts. And there are millions of them over the many years in Africa's independent history, and of course before that, but we're talking more recent history. And perhaps this is the time to be able to consult with people on the ground and ask the question, where is the voice of the common African man in the formation of an African court? Secondly, there seems to be a lack of honesty on both sides of this debate, hypocrisy, if you will. From the proponents of this court, especially in this current drive, they seem to forget that, like was spoken about in this conversation, 72% of the funding for the African Union comes from the same donors to the International Criminal Court and not from African states themselves. If, as they want this court to succeed, then the saying perhaps should hold true: put your money where your mouth is. However, on the other side, there seems to be a disbelief that there actually can be African solutions to African problems. There are very many things that have been said negatively about Africa in the past, and yet Africa has been able to overcome these kinds of problems. And so, in understanding the local context of any conflict that would be brought before the African Union Court, perhaps it would be more in the place of Africans themselves to understand that and to resolve it. And finally, in determining whether we need an African court, perhaps we also need to look ahead, if we do put this court together, at the legacy of this court. And here it requires quite a bit of honesty with respect to what's happened in Africa's past. It may provide prelude to what could happen in the future. Have African leaders played a big role in the conflicts in the past and in the present that we have seen? The answer to that is yes. Should they be excused from facing justice over their roles in committing crimes and perpetrating acts of injustice against the publics? That answer should be no. And if we're honest enough about what has happened in the past, then perhaps we'd be able to approach the subject with a bit more sobriety. But yes, indeed, there can be an African solution to African problems with this court, and that is the point.